A billionaire attempts to degrade his black maid at an exclusive gathering, but is shocked to discover her identity. She's the daughter of his lost childhood love, forcing him to confront his own biases and his past mistakes. And if you cherish your family and love stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and avoid 10 years of bad luck. Richard Thompson stood at the top of his marble staircase, surveying the crowd of New York's elite gathered in his mansion's grand foyer. The crystal chandeliers cast a golden glow across the sea of designer gowns and tailored suits. His fingers adjusted his platinum cufflinks, a nervous habit he developed over years of public speaking. The mansion buzzed with the quiet murmur of important conversations and the gentle clink of champagne flutes. Security personnel in dark suits maintained a discreet presence near the exits, while catering staff moved efficiently through the crowd. Among them was Angela, her simple black uniform marking her as part of the service staff rather than a guest. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard's voice carried across the room without effort, a skill honed through countless board meetings and charity galas. The crowd fell silent. "Welcome to the Thompson Annual Foundation Gala." He paused, allowing his guests to raise their glasses. "This year, our ventures have expanded into 17 new markets." His chest swelled slightly with pride. "Our profit margins have increased by 40%, and our charitable contributions have doubled." The crowd responded with appropriate applause. Richard's smile didn't quite reach his eyes as he continued listing achievements, each one carefully selected to remind his guests of his power and influence. From her position near the bar, Angela watched him, her face carefully neutral as she arranged champagne flutes on silver trays. The speech concluded, and Richard descended the stairs, accepting handshakes and congratulations from his peers. He moved through the crowd like a shark through water, smooth, purposeful, and somehow threatening despite his pleasant smile. The guests parted before him, reforming in his wake into smaller groups discussing business deals and society gossip. Angela approached one such group, offering drinks with practiced grace. Her movements were precise, almost invisible, the way wealthy employers preferred their staff to be. She'd learned early in this job how to move without drawing attention, how to serve without being seen. "Thompson's really outdone himself this year," a man in a navy suit commented, taking a champagne flute from Angela's tray without acknowledging her presence. The new tech acquisition was brilliant. Richard appeared behind the group, his presence immediately commanding attention. "The key is knowing when to strike," he said, reaching for a champagne flute. His eyes fell on Angela, and something flickered across his face. Displeasure, perhaps, or simple disdain. Though some people never learn their proper place in the world. The group laughed, a practice sound that echoed off the marble floors. Angela's hand tightened imperceptibly on her serving tray, but her face remained impassive. She'd endured worse in her years of service. "Tell me," Richard continued, his voice carrying just far enough to reach nearby groups, "doesn't our help remind you of those charity cases always demanding handouts?" Same vacant expression. More laughter, louder this time. Angela's eyes met Richard's for a fraction of a second. In that moment, something passed between them, a challenge, perhaps, or a promise. She turned away, moving through the crowd with the same practiced grace, but her posture had changed. There was steel in her spine now, purpose in her steps. Richard watched her go, his smile faltering slightly. Something about her had bothered him since she started working in his household 6 months ago. He couldn't quite place it, something in the set of her jaw, the way she held herself, reminded him of someone from long ago. The party continued around them, a carefully orchestrated display of wealth and power. Guests moved between the foyer and the adjacent rooms, discussing mergers and acquisitions, comparing vacation homes and private jets. Through it all, Angela continued her work, silent and efficient, but now there was something different in her eyes. She wasn't just observing anymore. She was waiting. Richard found his attention drawn to her repeatedly throughout the evening, though he tried to focus on his guests. Each time their paths crossed, that nagging feeling of familiarity grew stronger. It irritated him, this inability to place her, to categorize her neatly in his world of clear hierarchies and defined roles. As the evening wore on, the tension between them grew, invisible to the guests but palpable to both Richard and Angela. It was building towards something, though neither of them knew exactly what. For now, they maintained their roles, the powerful host and the invisible servant. But beneath the surface, something was shifting, preparing to upend their carefully constructed world. The cool evening air offered Angela a momentary respite from the suffocating atmosphere inside. She stood in the mansion's meticulously maintained garden, her back straight against a marble column. The sound of the party drifted through the French doors behind her, but here, among the carefully pruned roses and geometric hedges, she could finally breathe. Her hand moved to the locket hidden beneath her uniform, a small, worn silver piece that contained the only photo she had of her mother. In it, a young woman smiled at the camera, her eyes bright with hope and determination. Angela had memorized every detail of that face, searching for pieces of herself in those familiar features. The garden lights cast long shadows across the limestone paths. Angela closed her eyes, remembering the stories her aunt had told her about her mother. A brilliant young woman who'd fallen in love with the wrong man, who disappeared from their lives leaving only whispers and wafts. The same stories that had led Angela to seek employment in this very house. Taking an unauthorized break, Richard's voice cut through her thoughts like a knife. He stood in the doorway, silhouetted by the party lights behind him. His posture suggested casual authority, but there was something else in his stance, an uncertainty that hadn't been there before. Angela turned to face him, her hand dropping from the locket. "I was just ensuring the garden arrangements meet your standards, Mr. Thompson." Her voice was steady, professional, but carried an undercurrent of defiance. Richard stepped closer, his expensive shoes crunching on the gravel path. "Always the perfect servant, aren't you? So controlled, so." He paused, searching for the word familiar. The last word came out almost as a question. "Perhaps you're more familiar with my family than you realize," Angela said, her heart pounding but her voice remaining calm. She watched his face carefully, noting how his expression shifted from condescension to confusion. "What are you talking about?" Richard's voice had lost its edge of superiority, replaced by something closer to wariness. Angela reached for her locket, opening it with practiced ease. 25 years ago, you knew a woman named Sarah Jenkins. She held out the locket, the small photo visible in the garden lights. She worked in your father's company while putting herself through college. Richard's face drained of color as he stared at the photo. His hand reached for it automatically, then stopped midway. "Where did you get this?" His voice had dropped to a whisper. "She was my mother," Angela said simply, watching as the realization hit him. "The woman you claimed to love before your father threatened to disinherit you if you continued seeing her." Richard staggered slightly, reaching for the marble column to steady himself. His eyes darted between Angela's face and the photo, seeing for the first time the unmistakable resemblance, the same determined set of the jaw, the same challenging look in the eyes. "Sarah, she never told me." His voice trailed off, the implications of her words sinking in. "She never had the chance," Angela replied, her voice tight with controlled emotion. "By the time she discovered she was pregnant, you had already announced your engagement to Catherine Whitmore. The merger your father wanted so badly." The sounds of the party seemed to fade away, leaving them in a bubble of tense silence. Richard's carefully constructed world was crumbling around him, and Angela could see it happening in his eyes. "All these months working here," he managed finally. "You knew?" "I knew everything," Angela confirmed. "Every story, every detail. How you met her in the company library, your secret dates in Central Park, the promises you made." She paused, letting each word sink in. "And how quickly those promises were forgotten when faced with losing your inheritance." Richard's face had aged 10 years in the past few minutes. The arrogant billionaire was gone, replaced by a man confronting the consequences of choices made decades ago. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again, words failing him for perhaps the first time in his life. In the distance, A burst of laughter from the party served as a jarring reminder of the world beyond their private drama. Angela straightened her uniform, preparing to return to her duties. "We're not finished here," Richard said, his voice hoarse. "No," Angela agreed, meeting his eyes steadily. "We're just beginning." She turned and walked back toward the house, leaving Richard alone in the garden with his thoughts and the weight of his past decisions. The party continued inside, oblivious to the seismic shift that had just occurred in their perfectly ordered world. Richard remained in the garden long after Angela had left, his mind racing through memories he'd spent decades trying to suppress. The photograph in the locket had awakened something in him. Images of Sarah in the company library, her textbooks spread across the table, determination written across her features as she studied after her shift. He walked to his private study, away from the persistent chatter of the party. The room was a testament to his success. Dark mahogany shelves lined with leather-bound books, awards and certificates covering the walls. But now these symbols of achievement felt hollow, mere distractions from the choices he'd made. Opening his desk drawer, Richard pulled out an old photograph, worn at the edges from years of handling before being hidden away. It showed a younger version of himself with Sarah at a company picnic. They were laughing, his arm around her shoulders, both unaware of the photographer. He'd kept it all these years, though he'd never admitted that to anyone, not even himself. Meanwhile, in the kitchen, Angela was mechanically loading dishes into the industrial dishwasher, her movements automatic while her mind processed the confrontation. Other staff members moved around her, sensing her mood and giving her space. Maria, an older housekeeper who had worked for the Thompsons for over 2 decades, approached Angela carefully. "I saw you talking with Mr. Thompson in the garden," she said quietly, her voice carrying years of witnessed secrets. "I remember your mother." Angela's hands stilled on the champagne flute she was holding. "You knew her?" Maria nodded, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard. She was different from the other staff. Always reading, always learning. Mr. Thompson was different then, too. Younger, less? She searched for the right word, hardened. Other kitchen staff began gathering around, their own tasks momentarily forgotten. Many of them had experienced Richard's condescension firsthand, and the possibility of someone standing up to him drew them like moths to a flame. "My aunt told me they were in love," Angela said, her voice barely above a whisper. "That he promised to marry her, regardless of what his father thought." "It was true," Maria confirmed. "Everyone could see it. But then his father threatened to cut him off, to destroy Sarah's chances of ever working in finance again. Mr. Thompson chose his inheritance." The kitchen fell silent as the staff absorbed this information. Angela felt their support, unspoken but palpable. For years, they had all endured Richard's casual cruelty, his assumption of superiority. Now somehow, the power dynamic had shifted. Back in his study, Richard was pouring himself a drink, his hands shaking slightly. The party's sounds were muffled here, allowing him to hear his own thoughts clearly for the first time that evening. He remembered the day he'd told Sarah it was over, how she'd looked at him not with anger, but with disappointment. That look had haunted him more than any angry words could have. A knock at the study door interrupted his thoughts. It was James, his personal assistant of 15 years. "Sir, the guests are asking for you. The donation announcements are scheduled to begin in 10 minutes. Richard nodded absently, his eyes still on the old photograph. "James, do you remember Sarah Jenkins?" The assistant's carefully neutral expression flickered slightly. "Yes, sir. She worked in accounting while attending night classes." "Did you know she was pregnant when she left?" James hesitated, his professional mask cracking. "There were rumors, sir. Nothing confirmed." Richard's laugh was bitter. "And now her daughter serves champagne at my parties." He finished his drink in one swallow. "The universe has a sense of humor, doesn't it, James?" "Sir, about the donations. Tell them I'll be there shortly." Richard carefully returned the photograph to its drawer. "And James? Find out everything you can about Sarah Jenkins. What happened to her after she left, where she is now." As James left, Richard straightened his tie and prepared to return to his guests. But his thoughts remained in the past, with a young woman who had dared to dream of a different future, and with the choices that had led them all to this moment. In the kitchen, Angela was finishing her work, preparing to face the rest of the evening. The support of her fellow staff members had strengthened her resolve. She touched her mother's locket once more, drawing courage from it. The party continued upstairs, but beneath its glittering surface, everything had changed. The past had returned, demanding acknowledgement, refusing to be ignored any longer. Both Richard and Angela knew that after tonight, nothing would ever be the same. Richard rejoined his guests with practiced composure, though his mind was elsewhere. The ballroom's opulence, the crystal chandeliers, the imported marble floors, the priceless artwork, suddenly seemed like an elaborate shield he'd built against his own conscience. "Richard, darling," Catherine Whitmore Thompson, his wife of 25 years, approached with a group of society friends. "We were just discussing the new hospital wing. Surely you'll say a few words about it during the announcements?" Her smile was perfect, practiced, empty, like their marriage. He nodded mechanically, but his attention was drawn to Angela, who had resumed her duties serving drinks. She moved through the crowd with quiet dignity, her head held high despite the whispers and sideways glances from guests who'd witnessed his earlier mockery. "Is everything all right, dear?" Catherine touched his arm, her perfectly manicured nails glinting. "You seem distracted." Before he could respond, Bernard Wallace, his oldest friend and business partner, interrupted. "Richard, we need to discuss the Singapore merger. There's been a development." Bernard's eyes narrowed as he followed Richard's gaze to Angela. "Though perhaps we should focus on more pressing matters first. That servant girl seems to be causing quite a stir." Richard felt a surge of anger. At Bernard's tone, at his own past actions, at the entire system he'd helped perpetuate. "Her name is Angela," he said, his voice sharper than intended. Several nearby guests turned to look. "Richard," Catherine hissed, "not now." But Angela had heard. She approached their group, holding a tray of champagne flutes. "More champagne, Mr. Thompson?" Her voice was steady, professional, but her eyes held a challenge. The surrounding conversations quieted as tension filled the air. Richard reached for a glass, his hand trembling slightly. "Angela, I believe we need to continue our earlier discussion." "I don't think this is the appropriate time," Bernard interjected, reaching for Richard's arm. "The donations announcement will wait," Richard cut him off. He turned to Angela. "Would you join me in my study?" Catherine's face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "Richard, you cannot be serious. What will people think?" "They'll think," Angela said quietly, but clearly enough for those nearby to hear, "that Mr. Thompson is finally ready to have a long-overdue conversation about family." The word family hung in the air like a thunderclap. Catherine's eyes widened as she looked between Richard and Angela, seeing for the first time the subtle similarities in their features. "Richard," she whispered, "what is she talking about?" But Richard was already walking toward his study, Angela following at a respectful distance. The party guests parted before them, their quiet murmurs growing into a steady buzz of speculation. Inside the study, Richard closed the door, shutting out the noise and curious stares. Angela stood near his desk, her serving tray now set aside. The power dynamic had shifted. She was no longer just a servant, and they both knew it. "You've orchestrated this perfectly," Richard said, a hint of admiration in his voice. "Getting hired here, waiting for the right moment." "I learned from the best," Angela replied. "Isn't calculated timing what made you your fortune?" Richard winced at the jab. "Your mother, Sarah, she was more than just a passing romance." "You need to understand." "What I understand," Angela interrupted, "is that you made a choice. A choice that affected not just your life, but the lives of others. My mother worked 3 jobs to put herself through school after you abandoned her. She never asked you for anything." "I didn't know she was pregnant," Richard protested, but his voice lacked conviction. "Would it have made a difference?" Angela's question hung in the air between them. Before Richard could answer, the door opened. Catherine stood there, her face a mask of controlled fury. "Richard, the guests are waiting. Whatever this situation is, it can be handled discreetly, through proper channels." "Propres channels." Angela laughed, a sound without humor. "Like the channels your husband used when he paid my mother to disappear? Or the channels that ensured she never worked in finance again, despite her degree?" Catherine turned to Richard, her composure cracking. Is it true? Is she the daughter you never knew about? Angela finished for her. The inconvenient truth that would have derailed your perfectly planned life? Yes, Mrs. Thompson, I am. The study fell into tense silence. Outside, the party continued, but in here, decades of secrets and lies were crumbling. Richard moved to his desk, bracing himself against it. All these years, he said finally, I told myself I made the right choice, that it was better for everyone. I convinced myself Sarah would move on, find someone else. He looked at Angela. I never imagined, never allowed myself to imagine. A daughter, Angela finished. A daughter who would grow up watching her mother struggle, who would piece together the story of her father from old photographs and whispered conversations. A daughter who would eventually, LY decide to look you in the eye and make you face what you'd done. The weight of her words filled the room, making it hard to breathe. The carefully constructed walls of privilege and power that had protected Richard for so long were crumbling, leaving him exposed to the truth he'd spent decades avoiding. In the heavy silence of the study, Richard moved to the window, looking out at the garden where their earlier confrontation had begun. The party lights cast long shadows across the manicured lawn, reminding him of another garden, decades ago, where he'd last seen Sarah. You have her eyes, he said quietly, still facing the window. I noticed it the first day you started working here, but I convinced myself it was impossible. His voice cracked slightly. Sarah always had this way of looking right through pretense, seeing things as they really were. Angela's stance softened slightly, though she remained guarded. The library, she said. Mom used to tell me about meeting you there. She'd stay late after her shift, studying for her finance classes. You brought her coffee. Richard turned, surprise evident on his face. She told you about that? She told me everything, Angela replied. How you discussed market trends while she studied. How you believed in her dreams when everyone else said she was reaching too high. She paused, her voice hardening. How you promised none of it would matter. Not class, not race, not your father's threats. Catherine, who had been standing silently by the door, made a small sound of distress. Richard, we need to handle this privately. The guests can wait. Richard cut her off, his voice firm. He walked to his desk, opened a drawer, and pulled out the old photograph he'd been looking at earlier. This was taken at the company picnic, summer of '98. He held it out to Angela. She took it carefully, studying the image of her mother's laughing face. I've never seen this picture before. She was brilliant, Richard said softly. Not just smart, though she was that too, but brilliant in the way she saw the world. She had plans to revolutionize minority lending practices, to create financial education programs in underserved communities. He laughed bitterly. My father called them dangerous ideas. She did it anyway, Angela said, pride evident in her voice. After you left, after she had me, she finished her degree. Started small financial literacy workshops in our community. They grew into a nonprofit that's helped hundreds of families. Richard's head snapped up. The Jenkins Foundation for Financial Education? That's Sarah's? Angela nodded. She built it from nothing. No connections, no inherited wealth, just determination and a belief that everyone deserves a chance to understand and control their financial future. Catherine moved further into the room, her social mask slipping to reveal genuine curiosity. I've heard of that foundation. They've done remarkable work in urban communities. Work that could have been done on a much larger scale, Angela pointed out, with the right support 25 years ago. Richard sank into his chair, the weight of missed opportunities and wrong choices visible in his posture. Your mother succeeded despite me, not because of me. He looked up at Angela. She never remarried? No, Angela replied softly. She said she'd already found true love once, and that was enough. She focused on me and her work. She hesitated, then added, she died 3 years ago. Cancer. The news hit Richard like a physical blow. He closed his eyes, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. I never knew. I should have. Yes, you should have, Angela agreed, but her voice had lost some of its edge. She moved to the window, looking out at the garden as Richard had done earlier. She wasn't bitter, you know. Disappointed, yes, but not bitter. She used to tell me that everyone has to make their own choices and live with the consequences. The sound of the party filtered through the walls, a stark reminder of the world beyond this room. But here, in this moment, the barriers of class and privilege had temporarily dissolved, leaving three people grappling with the impact of choices made long ago. "Tell me about her," Richard said suddenly. "Please. What was she like as a mother?" Catherine moved toward the door. "I'll handle the guests," she said quietly, understanding that this moment wasn't for her. As she left, Angela took a seat across from Richard, still holding the photograph. "She was amazing," Angela began, her voice soft with memory. "She worked so hard, but she never missed a school event. She'd help me with homework at the diner where she worked nights, teaching me math using sugar packets and coffee creamers." As Angela shared stories of her childhood, Richard listened intently, learning about the life he could have been part of, the family he'd given up for wealth and status. Outside, the party continued. But in the study, two people began the delicate process of understanding each other, connected by memories of a woman who had loved them both. The muffled sounds of the party grew louder as Bernard opened the study door without knocking. "Richard, this is becoming embarrassing. The donors are waiting, and rumors are starting too." He stopped abruptly, taking in the scene, Richard and Angela sitting across from each other, the old photograph between them, tears evident on both their faces. Richard stood slowly, straightening his jacket. 20 years of friendship with Bernard meant he could read the calculation behind his friend's concerned expression. "Let them wait," he said firmly. "Be reasonable," Bernard pressed. "Whatever this situation is, it can be handled quietly. I know some excellent lawyers who specialize in discretion." He lowered his voice. "We can make arrangements that would be generous enough to ensure everyone's silence." Angela watched Richard carefully, seeing the conflict play across his face. The same choice he'd faced 25 years ago was before him again. Status and appearances, or human connection and truth. "Richard," Bernard continued, "think about the company, the shareholders, your reputation, my reputation." Richard interrupted, his voice sharp. "My reputation is built on destroying the dreams of a brilliant young woman because she didn't fit into my father's vision of suitable society." He picked up the photograph from his desk. "On abandoning my own child because I was too cowardly to stand up to him." Bernard's expression hardened. "Your father protected you from a gold digger who would have, don't you dare." Richard's voice cut through the air like a whip. "Sarah Jenkins earned everything she achieved. She built something meaningful, while I've spent 25 years accumulating wealth I don't need and power I don't deserve." The party sound swelled as Catherine reappeared at the door. "Richard, people are starting to leave. The Whitneys are particularly offended, and they were considering a major donation." "Let them leave," Richard said quietly. The room fell silent. Even Angela looked surprised. "Have you lost your mind?" Bernard demanded. "These people represent millions in potential investments. Your father worked his entire life to build these connections. My father," Richard said, his voice gaining strength, "was wrong. About Sarah, about what really matters, about everything." He turned to Angela. "And I was wrong to listen to him." Catherine stepped fully into the room, closing the door behind her. "Richard, think about what you're doing. One emotional moment shouldn't undo decades of careful work. We can find a way to acknowledge this connection privately." Richard looked between his wife and his oldest friend, seeing clearly for the first time the gilded cage they represented. He glanced at Angela, who remained silent, watching. This was his choice to make. Walking to his desk, Richard pressed the intercom button. "James, please come to my study immediately." Moments later, James appeared, his professional mask firmly in place despite the obvious tension in the room. "James," Richard said calmly, "please return to the ballroom and announce that I'll be making my address in 5 minutes. Ensure all remaining guests are present." "Richard, don't," Bernard warned. "Think about what you're risking. I've spent 25 years thinking about what I risked, what I lost by making the wrong choice." Richard's voice was steady now, certain. "I won't make the same mistake again." Catherine sank into a chair, her composure finally cracking. "You'll destroy everything we've built." "No," Richard replied, gentler now. I'll finally build something real. He turned to Angela. If you let me try. Angela stood slowly. What are you planning to do? Tell the truth, Richard said simply. All of it. About Sarah, about you, about my father's manipulation, and my own cowardice. He managed a small smile. Your mother believed in transparency and justice. It's time I honored that. Bernard moved to block the door. I won't let you commit social suicide. It's not your choice to make, Richard replied, moving past him. He paused in the doorway, looking back at Angela. Will you come with me? Angela hesitated, studying him carefully. In his eyes, she saw something new, not the arrogant billionaire from earlier in the evening, but perhaps a glimpse of the man her mother had once loved. Remember, she said quietly, once you do this, there's no going back. Richard nodded. I've spent 25 years going in the wrong direction. It's time to turn around. Together, they walked toward the ballroom, leaving behind a sputtering Bernard and a shocked Catherine. The party awaited them, and with it, the moment of truth that would change everything. The walk to the ballroom felt like the longest of Richard's life. Each step echoed against the marble floors, marking the distance between who he had been and who he was choosing to become. Angela walked beside him, their matched pace creating a subtle harmony that didn't go unnoticed by the watching staff. Just before entering the ballroom, Richard paused. Before we do this, he said quietly, I need you to know something. The sounds of restless guests filtered through the closed doors. I'm not doing this for redemption or forgiveness. I don't deserve either. Angela turned to face him. Then why? Because Sarah deserved better. You deserved better. And because it's time I stop hiding from the truth. He straightened his tie, a gesture that seemed almost comical now. But I need to know, what do you want from this? The question caught Angela off guard. She'd spent months planning her confrontation with Richard, but hadn't fully considered what would come after. She paused, choosing her words carefully. I want the truth to be known, not just about my mother and me, but about how power and privilege can destroy lives when wielded carelessly. Richard nodded slowly. And after? What happens then? That depends on you, Angela replied. Mom always said everyone deserves a chance to change, to make better choices. But changes and choices mean nothing without actions behind them. James appeared beside them, his professional demeanor slightly strained. Sir, the guests are assembled. Mr. Wallace is attempting to start the donation announcements himself. Of course he is, Richard muttered. He turned back to Angela. I can't undo the past 25 years. I can't give you back the father you should have had. No, Angela agreed. You can't. But you can stop being the man who made those choices and start being someone different. The ballroom doors opened slightly, and Catherine slipped out, her face tight with controlled panic. Richard, please. Think about what this means. The board will demand your resignation. Our friends will abandon us. Everything we've built, Richard interrupted, is a facade. A beautiful, expensive facade hiding ugly truths. He looked at Angela. Your mother understood real value. She built something meaningful, something that actually helped people. The foundation, Angela said softly. It was her life's work. Richard straightened, decision crystallizing in his eyes. James, when I begin my speech, I want you to transfer $50 million from my personal accounts to the Jenkins Foundation for Financial Education. Catherine gasped. James blinked but nodded, pulling out his phone to prepare the transfer. Money doesn't fix this, Angela warned. No, Richard agreed, but it can help your mother's work continue and expand. Not as compensation for what I did, but as recognition of what she achieved despite me. He paused. If you'll accept it. Angela studied him for a long moment. On one condition, she finally said. You don't just throw money at it and walk away. You get involved. Learn about the work. Understand what Mom was trying to accomplish. The board won't allow, Catherine began. I don't care what the board allows, Richard cut her off. Not anymore. He turned to Angela. I accept your condition. The ballroom doors opened again, and Bernard emerged, his face red with effort and anxiety. Richard, this is your last chance. Think about your legacy. Richard looked at Angela, then back at Bernard. I am thinking about my legacy. For the first time in 25 years, I'm thinking about what really matters." He offered his arm to Angela, a gesture both formal and deeply personal. After a moment's hesitation, she took it. Together, they walked past Bernard and Catherine, past the shocked expressions of the staff, and through the ballroom doors. The crowd fell silent as they appeared, hundreds of faces turning to stare at the unlikely pair. Richard led Angela not to the side of the room where servants usually stood, but directly to the center stage where a microphone waited. The whispers started immediately. Richard could see the confusion, the speculation, the growing understanding on some faces. He caught sight of several board members in the crowd, their expressions ranging from concern to outright hostility. But for the first time in decades, Richard Thompson didn't care about managing perceptions or maintaining appearances. He had a truth to tell, and beside him stood living proof of both his greatest mistake and his chance for redemption. He stepped up to the microphone, Angela still at his side, and began to speak. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard began, his voice steady despite the tension in the room. "For 25 years, I've stood at events like this, talking about numbers and achievements, as if wealth was the only measure of success that mattered." The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Several board members exchanged worried glances. In the back of the room, Bernard was frantically typing on his phone, likely trying to contain the impending damage. "But tonight," Richard continued, "I want to talk about different kinds of wealth and different kinds of poverty." He looked at Angela. 25 years ago, I made a choice based on fear and greed. I chose money over love, status over integrity. And in doing so, I abandoned a woman who embodied everything I claimed to admire: intelligence, determination, and vision. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Catherine had moved to stand near the exit, her face a mask of controlled panic. But Richard pressed on. Her name was Sarah Jenkins. She worked in our company while putting herself through college, dreaming of creating financial education programs for underserved communities. His voice grew stronger. "When she became pregnant with my child, I chose my inheritance over her. Over them." The murmur became a buzz of shocked whispers. Several guests began recording on their phones, while others looked away in embarrassment or judgment. "That child," Richard guessed, turned to Angela, "grew up to be the woman standing beside me. Angela Jenkins, my daughter, who has shown more courage and integrity in confronting me tonight than I've shown in my entire life." Angela stepped forward, her head held high. The crowd's reaction was immediate. People who had ignored her all evening now stared openly, seeing her with new eyes. "But this isn't just about personal redemption," Richard continued. Sarah Jenkins went on to found the Jenkins Foundation for Financial Education, an organization that has helped thousands of families achieve financial literacy and independence. "She succeeded not because of me, but in spite of me." He paused, letting his words sink in. "Tonight, I'm announcing an immediate donation of $50 million to the Jenkins Foundation." More gasps from the crowd. "Not as compensation for my past actions, but as an investment in Sarah's vision, a vision I was too blind to see 25 years ago." Bernard finally pushed his way to the stage. "Richard, that's enough." "No, Bernard, it's not nearly enough." Richard's voice cut through the room. "For too long, we've convinced ourselves that success means accumulating wealth while ignoring the human cost. Sarah understood that real success means lifting others up, creating opportunities, making a genuine difference." He turned to address the board members directly. "I know this revelation will likely cost me my position, my social standing, and many of my so-called friends. I accept that. What I won't accept is continuing to live a lie." Angela stepped to the microphone. "My mother never wanted revenge," she said, her clear voice commanding attention. "She built her foundation to prove that everyone deserves a chance to understand and control their financial future, regardless of their background. She succeeded because she never lost sight of what really mattered: helping others, maintaining her integrity, and showing her daughter that principles are worth more than privileges." Richard nodded, emotion evident in his voice. "Which is why, beyond the donation, I'm committing to work directly with the Jenkins Foundation, learning about and supporting their programs. Not as a distant benefactor, but as someone who needs to understand what real value means. The room erupted in chaos. Board members huddled in urgent discussion. Society friends whispered behind their hands, and reporters who had been covering the gala were frantically taking notes. But through it all, Richard and Angela stood together on stage, neither backing down. For the first time in decades, Richard felt truly free. Free from pretense, from his father's shadow, from the golden cage he'd built around himself. "I know this is a lot to process," he addressed the crowd one final time. "Some of you will distance yourselves from me after tonight. Some will try to minimize or discredit this revelation. That's your choice to make." He straightened his shoulders. "I made the wrong choice once. I won't make it again." As the chaos continued to unfold, Angela turned to Richard. "This isn't how I expected this evening to end," she said quietly. "No," Richard agreed, watching as some guests began to leave while others pressed forward, eager to be part of this dramatic moment. "But perhaps it's how it needed to end." He paused. "Your mother would have handled this with more grace." "Maybe," Angela replied, "but she would have appreciated the honesty." She looked out at the crowd, then back at Richard. "This is just the beginning, you know. Things will get complicated." Richard nodded, watching as Bernard gathered with board members near the exit, their expressions promising difficult days ahead. "I know, but for the first time in 25 years, I'm ready to face those complications honestly." The evening that had begun with casual cruelty was ending with unexpected truth, and neither the Thompson Empire nor its participants would ever be quite the same. In the aftermath of Richard's announcement, the ballroom had transformed into a scene of barely contained chaos. Security personnel moved to control the growing media presence as guests either fled or pressed closer, each choosing their allegiances in real time. Catherine finally approached the stage, her social mask completely fallen away. "Well," she said, her voice tight but controlled, "I suppose 25 years of marriage deserves at least a private conversation before you destroy everything." Richard met her gaze steadily. "You knew, didn't you? About Sarah?" "I knew there was someone," Catherine admitted, her voice low enough that only Richard and Angela could hear. "Your father assured me it was handled." She looked at Angela with new eyes. "I never knew about a child. Would it have made a difference?" Angela asked, echoing her earlier question to Richard. Catherine's silence was answer enough. After a moment, she straightened her shoulders. "I'll have my lawyer contact you tomorrow, Richard." She turned to leave, then paused. "For what it's worth, you do look like him. Around the eyes." With that, she walked away, her dignity intact if nothing else. James appeared beside them, his professional demeanor showing cracks of genuine concern. "Sir, the transfer to the Jenkins Foundation is complete." And, he hesitated, "the board is calling an emergency meeting for tomorrow morning." "Of course they are," Richard said, a hint of his old, dry humor returning. "Schedule it for 8 a.m. Might as well face the firing squad early." "Richard," Bernard's voice boomed across the now half-empty ballroom as he approached the stage. "The chairman is on the phone. He's demanding answers." "Tell him he'll have them tomorrow," Richard replied. "Tonight, I have more important matters to attend to." He turned to Angela. "If you're willing, I'd like to hear more about your mother. About the foundation. About you." Bernard's face reddened. "This is business suicide, Richard. Everything your father built. My father built an empire on exclusion and prejudice." Richard cut him off. "Sarah built something that actually helps people. Which legacy would you be prouder of?" The question hung in the air between them. Bernard opened his mouth to respond, then closed it, looking at Angela with a mixture of confusion and dawning recognition. "The garden room," Richard said to Angela. "It's quieter there, and I think we both have stories to share." As they walked away from the stage, leaving Bernard and the remaining guests to their speculation, Angela spoke softly. "You understand this doesn't fix everything. One grand gesture doesn't erase 25 years. "I know," Richard replied, "but maybe it's a start." They reached the garden room, its glass walls offering a view of the illuminated grounds where their confrontation had begun hours earlier. "I'd like to visit her grave, if you'll show me where it is." Angela studied him for a long moment. "She's buried near the community center, where she started her first financial literacy classes." Simple headstone, but there's always fresh flowers. The people she helped, they never forgot her. Richard's eyes filled with tears. While I spent years adding zeros to my bank account, she was changing lives, building something real. It wasn't about the money for her, Angela said, taking a seat in one of the room's comfortable chairs. It was about dignity, about giving people the knowledge and tools to control their own destinies. Tell me about the Foundation's current projects, Richard said, sitting across from her. I meant what I said about getting involved. I want to understand her work, continue her legacy. Even after the board forces you out tomorrow? Especially then. Richard managed a small smile. I've spent 25 years being the man my father wanted me to be. Maybe it's time to become the man your mother once believed I could be. Outside, the last guests were leaving, their cars filling the CIR killer driveway. The staff had begun cleaning up, their whispered conversations undoubtedly centered on the evening's revelations. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, board meetings, legal proceedings, media speculation. But in the quiet of the garden room, a father and daughter began the delicate process of building something new from the ruins of what had been destroyed. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was perhaps the beginning of understanding. She kept your picture, Angela said suddenly, in her bedside drawer. I found it after she died. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a worn photograph. I think you should have it. Richard took the photo with trembling hands. It showed him and Sarah at a park, both young and laughing, his arm around her waist. On the back, in Sarah's handwriting, were the words, "Love sees no barriers." She was right, Richard whispered. She always was. The night that had begun with cruelty and prejudice was ending with truth and possibility. Outside, the garden lights illuminated the path forward, uncertain but clear. The peaceful moment in the garden room was interrupted by James entering with an elderly man in tow. Richard recognized him immediately, Harold Matthews, his father's former legal counsel, now well into his 80s. I apologize for the intrusion, Harold said, his voice carrying the weight of decades. But after watching the news alert about tonight's revelations, I felt compelled to come. He looked at Angela, his expression a mixture of recognition and regret. You look so much like your mother. Richard stood, tension evident in his posture. Harold, whatever the board has sent you to say, I'm not here for the board, Harold interrupted, lowering himself into a chair. I'm here because I've carried this burden for 25 years, and tonight's events have finally freed me from an old promise. Angela leaned forward, something in the old man's tone catching her attention. What promise? Harold pulled an envelope from his jacket pocket, aged and slightly yellowed. Your father didn't simply abandon your mother, my dear. He was systematically deceived by his father, by me, and by others who claimed to have his best interests at heart. Richard's face paled. What are you talking about? Your father, Richard Thompson Sr., knew about the pregnancy, Harold said quietly. He intercepted Sarah's letters to you. He arranged for her transfer to another city, telling her it was for her own protection. Harold's voice cracked slightly. He even created false evidence, suggesting she had accepted a significant payment to disappear. No, Richard whispered, but Harold continued. What your father didn't know, what none of us knew, was that Sarah came from money herself. Old money, carefully hidden by her parents who wanted her to make her own way in the world. When she died, she left behind not just a successful foundation, but a significant fortune. Angela sat very still. My grandmother's inheritance. Mom never touched it, said it wasn't earned. The Jenkins family, Harold explained, has been quietly influential in banking for generations. They believed in working from the ground up, in understanding every level of finance. Sarah's choice to work as a clerk while attending college wasn't about necessity. It was about learning the business from the bottom up. Richard collapsed back into his chair, the implications hitting him. All this time, my father's justification for separating us, his claims about her being after the family money, were not just wrong, but ironically backward, Harold confirmed. The Jenkins family's private holdings exceed even the Thompson fortune. Sarah could have bought this mansion several times over, but she chose instead to build something meaningful. Angela stood abruptly, walking to the window. Mom never told me about the Thompson fortune. She never said anything about being kept from Richard. She just focused on helping others. Because that's who she was, Harold said gently. The money, both families' money, was never what mattered to her. She wanted to make a real difference. Richard looked at the envelope in Harold's hands. What's in there? Letters, Harold replied. From Sarah to you, intercepted by your father. And documentation of the Jenkins family trust, which names Angela as the sole heir. He held out the envelope. I should have done this years ago, but your father's influence, his threats. I was a coward. Angela turned from the window. So all this time, while Richard thought he was protecting his fortune from a gold digger, he was actually being manipulated into rejecting someone from one of the oldest banking families in America, Harold finished. Your grandfather, Richard, didn't care about the money. He cared about control, about maintaining what he saw as proper social order. Sarah's race mattered more to him than any fortune. Richard took the envelope with shaking hands. All these years, all the choices I made based on lies. The choice was still yours, Angela said quietly. Money or no money, you chose status over love. Yes, Richard acknowledged. I did, and that's something I'll have to live with. He looked at the envelope, then at Angela. But maybe now we can build something new? Not based on money, yours or mine, but on truth. On doing what your mother always wanted to do, making a real difference. Harold struggled to his feet. The board meeting tomorrow. They'll try to force you out, Richard. But with the Jenkins family connections, with the truth about Sarah's background. No, Richard and Angela said simultaneously. They looked at each other surprised. The foundation continues as it is, Angela said firmly. Mom built it from nothing, helped people who had nothing. That doesn't change because of some trust fund. Richard nodded. And I'll face the board as myself, not as someone backed by another fortune. It's time I stood on my own principles, not someone else's power. Harold smiled slightly. Sarah would have been proud of that answer. From both of you. As the old lawyer left, Richard and Angela sat in silence, processing the night's final revelation. Outside, the first hints of dawn were appearing over the Manhattan skyline. So, Richard said finally, it seems we both have inheritances we never knew about. The only inheritance that matters, Angela replied, is the one Mom left in her work, her vision. She paused. But having the resources to expand that vision, to help more people, a small smile crossed her face. She'd like that. Richard stood, straightening his jacket out of habit. I meant what I said. About working with the foundation, about learning. Money or no money, I want to understand what Sarah built, what you're continuing. Angela nodded slowly. Okay, but we do it her way. From the ground up. No shortcuts, no buying influence. I wouldn't have it any other way, Richard replied. He looked at the photograph still in his hand, at Sarah's words about love, seeing no barriers. Your mother changed lives by seeing people as they really were, by believing in their potential. Yes, Angela agreed. She did. She stood, smoothing her uniform, the last time she would wear it. Ready to face tomorrow? Richard looked at his daughter, seeing in her face not just Sarah's features, but Sarah's determination, her integrity, her vision for a better world. Ready, he said. And for the first time in 25 years, he truly was. The sun rose over Manhattan, illuminating two people who had begun the night as master and servant, transformed through truth into something far more complex and meaningful. The fortress of privilege Richard had built around himself had crumbled, but from its ruins, something stronger was emerging, a chance to honor Sarah's legacy by finally becoming the man she had always believed he could be. The end. D was really just another beginning,